Zeke, can you tell me about the finance Bible story, please?
Absolutely. So I guess we'll start it from the very beginning where we like to start for everything. It would have been a good, I want to say like maybe 4 years ago, give or take. And I was working in a company that was doing like financial planning and mortgage broking and property investing and all of that kind of thing. And I had a new colleague there. His name was Oscar. He's actually the co-founder of the Finance Bible. And we were doing a meeting with this client and we were trying to help him figure out, financially what he does for himself, his wife, and their young daughter coming across from India into Australia, how they set everything up and that kind of thing. They'd landed professional jobs. And in that meeting, we were able to make a substantial impact on their long term future. They're still a client of ours today, actually. So, yeah, wonderful meeting that was. But on the way back from that, Oscar and I were in the car and we were having a chat and we we're just thinking, how do we find a way to do that for the masses? We obviously can't sit down with every single individual in the world. You'd have billions of hours to do that, obviously. And we thought, you know what, let's start a podcast and let's just put a little bit of financial information out there and see if we can actually help people and see if they tune in, see if they want to be educated on the fact. So that's kind of how the actual podcast idea came about. And we've been doing it ever since then for many years now. So that's probably the best way to say how it started.
Helping people at scale with their personal finance. Is that the proper way to summarize it? Cool.
Absolutely.
In our first chat, you told me a very interesting story about how you started this journey, not of the podcast, but like of the business behind it and how you were helping individuals. So can you share with us like how you came about having your own shop of helping people with their personal finances?
I'll rewind to even before then. So we'll go real deep into history here. When I first got out of school, I started working for a bank, and we all know how banks are. Obviously, it wasn't that amazing, wasn't that helpful for people in the world, and
Why would you say
I was
that?
sort of
Hmm.
great question. Um, I I ended up at a point there where I got promoted enough where I actually had access to see how much money we were making off each client, and what their lifetime value was, and that kind of thing, their fees per year, and so on. And so I pretty quickly left that job when I realized, hang on a minute, I'm sick of people calling up and asking for an advance on their pension. They can't afford to live. Like, there's got to be something better I can be doing. And so I went into superannuation in Australia is like your retirement funding. So I went into that, exactly the same issues. So then I moved into insurance because if people are getting insurance and you're helping them if they pass away or if they've got income protection, can't go to work, exactly the same problem. So I found myself in this never ending circle of problems of how do I actually make a difference in the world without being a bit of a scoundrel? And yeah, I ended up
To put the words.
going into a financial planning firm that also did property investing and mortgage broking. And then I sort of had the knowledge where I could pull it all together, the insurance, the superannuation, the banking, broking, housing, all of it. And so I was working there for a while, and that's where I met the colleague Oscar. And we sort of noticed that things weren't going after a few years the way that they should have been within the company, that is. And there was some recommendations that we didn't entirely agree with. And so we decided, well, why don't we just do this on our own? Because we'd had the finance Bible then for probably 2 years. We had a good fan or audience base behind us where we could carry on and get things done. And so we created the company. We left that company and been doing with that now for a few years as well. And yeah, we're just out here trying to make a difference. And we've been able to do that for close to 500,000 clients now. And we're still going strong. So
That's how Asset Road started, right? That's the name of the company that is behind the podcast, or vice versa, depending on how you position it. But that's how you started the company. So obviously there are lots of resources around personal finances, right, everywhere. And yet you're doing awesome because Asset Road is growing and like Finance Bible Story has quite some reviews and is getting traction. How can you explain that? Like, what made the success, in your opinion, of the Finance Bible Story when you know that there is the Dave Ramsey's of this world. It's more US, but like obviously the finance advice that he gives is like can be applied anywhere in the world. Like, how do you differentiate in such a crowded space when it comes to personal finance?
Sorry, I missed about half of that question.
Fair enough. Please, Alex, make sure to edit that out. Was it an audio bug or something, Zeke?
I think it was, yeah. It just I had no audio whatsoever come through. Yeah, you were
Okay.
talking and then your mouth was moving and then we're back.
There are lots of resources out there around personal finance, right? It may have not been the case 4 years ago though, but today, like, there are the Dave Ramsey's of this world. It's more US, right? Obviously, but I guess his advice can be applied everywhere. So there are lots of resources around personal finance. But obviously, you've made yours successful, right? The podcast is getting traction. Asset Road is working. How do you differentiate in such a crowded market? Like, what? How can you explain the success of it?
That's a great question. Well, initially, when we were kind of coming up with the idea of launching the Finance Bible to be it, sort of have that education out there, we were looking at different resources. And I have a very young sister who I have obviously helped learn about the finance world and that. And I was thinking back to when I was getting started, what was out there to help me? What did I use and what couldn't I use and that kind of thing? And in Australia, we have this bloke called Scott Pape, and he's basically, they call him the barefoot investor. And he's got a book which goes into very minor detail of setting yourself up financially. So his method is basically you've got 3 buckets and you run the tap and that bucket fills up, which is like your main thing. And then the overflow goes into the other 2 sectors of your life. But it's very general and like minimalistic. It's just a simple get set up kind of thing. So I was kind of thinking, all right, how do we be different in the fact that Ramsey's very like debt focused? I feel like he focuses a lot on like paying down debts and how you get out of bad situations. Scott is very, you know, setting things up initially, but I couldn't find much for in between that. Like, you know, if you're just a standard, you know, young family, you've just had 2 kids, you're 30 years old, you've got a house with a mortgage, like what do you do then? Or
Yeah.
if you're a step beyond that and you're in your 40s and your kids might be about to move out, you've paid down your house, you've got equity in there, what do you do from there? So we kind of wanted to be able to educate people in that part of their life because that's where most of the clients were that we were meeting, and they were leaving it slightly too late to actually take advantage of things they could have. Like if they started 10 years earlier, they would have been millions of dollars better off. And
Interesting.
we thought, let's start off in that segment of the market, and then we'll release other episodes about like younger people, like for example, buying your first home or paying off a credit card or whatever, and we'll see what people want to hear based on our listening.
Yeah.
And from that, we were able to then dictate, okay, well, there's clearly a gap here. People are looking for this. And we sort of just expanded on that. But we do a lot of different things now because we want everyone to get the best education they can.
Let's get to it. Now I'm curious. What would you recommend for a young couple in their 30s who just had 2 kids? Like what's the 101 advice of personal finance there? Because indeed, when you listen to Dave, which is the only personal finance podcast or content that I follow sometimes, it's indeed like pay down your debt. Like you need to pay your debt off. And then once you're there, you're going to take baby steps. And I don't even remember all the baby steps, but like have an emergency fund and then start investing in your retirement plan. Well, that's in the US, obviously. So what's your advice, Zeke? Young couple in their 30s, 2 kids. What should we do?
A great question. And it will vary per person and per circumstance. And by no means am I going to provide financial advice. So everyone out there, do your own research.
True.
Yeah, that's okay.
Disclaimer.
But yeah, generally speaking, you're in your 30s, you've got 2 children, you probably own your house, you probably got a mortgage on there. If you've got 2 children, you probably bought the house before you first, so you might have it for 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 if you're lucky. So you will have had a bit of equity growth in there. You probably have a savings fund. You probably have an offset account. And you probably have a little amount of credit card debt, but nothing too outrageous, like you're not spiraling. Then the position kind of comes, okay, what's next? Are you either A, in the category where you're just sort of struggling day by day, Or you be in the category where you're able to save a little bit. You might be thinking about holidays, but young children, that's very hard to take them on the holiday, I mean. So generally what we find here is if they've got maybe 150,000 in equity in their property, they've got their offset account, they've got a rainy day fund or emergency fund, whatever you want to call it, stage, they've actually got the potential normally to then invest and start building that future. So they might be able to, without even putting their actual own money into it, they might be able to refinance, cross collateralize, or pull money out of their home and put it into another investment property that will then go up in value and pay them a rent as well. In that circumstance, if you can start that in your 30s, then, if people are normally starting 45, you've got a whole cycle there of doubling the value of that property. Property averages about a 6% return per year. That's dating back about 100 years. From 2000, it's averaged about 9% per year. So if you go, and that's in Australia only, yeah, it's actually dollar for dollar outperformed the stock market in Australia, which is wild. But if you get that investment early, and let's just say it's a $500,000 property, it's nothing extravagant, it's just there paying the rent, then it's worth $1 million in 10 years minimum.
Yeah.
So you generate an extra $500,000 in overall assets without the debt attached to it, because your debt's only on the initial property, or the initial property value. So if you focused on just paying down your current debt, which might be a 6% home loan or a 5.5% home loan, then yeah, sure, you might get that paid off or mostly paid off in that 10-year period. But let's say you pay off 300 grand of your loan, you've made 500 grand on the property. So one of them gives you an extra $200,000. And that's what we're trying to educate people on. You don't need to just sit there and smash away your debt. You can use it and do better things and make more money. And then if you're not comfortable with debt, guess what? You're 30 years old. When you're 50, sell it all. You've got more money. You can do whatever you need to do.
It's leveraging debt, right? To get others to pay for it, and you build wealth on this. What you just described is what you're going to help, obviously, on a much deeper level, individuals with, right? With Asset Road, and your company. And on the podcast, you're going to try to break down concepts and, steer people towards the right direction with personal finance. Maybe the ones who are not ready yet to have a personal advisor or finance advisor to really help them with their wealth. How do you link the two? Like, how do you make sure that the Finance Bible story is also somehow linked to Asset Road and vice versa, potentially?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess if we start off with the Finance Bible, we'll come back to Asset Road. Ultimately, people that find the Finance Bible are out there looking for some kind of information. They're at a point in their life where they're like, hey, I'm not extremely up to scratch in my finances. I want to learn more. And that's how they stumble across that. It might be on our Instagram. It might be it's just popped up on Spotify or whatever. Their friend might listen to it and refer them to it. They're ultimately finding that and wanting to learn about finances. And so when we teach them about the finances, eventually they get to a point where they're like, okay, these guys know what they're talking about. And then when the time comes, they'll reach out to Asset Road for more help. And that's when we can provide a professional service. The other way to go about it is, let's say we're at Asset Road and we get a client come through and they're not exactly in a position where they're able to invest in what we're sort of going for. Then we're in a position where we can help build that trust and we can nurture them. We can keep them educated. We can send them through to the Finance Bubble podcast where they then learn more and more about investing and their finances. And eventually they get in a position where they're like, okay, we've taken these steps we've got set up because we had episodes on that. And then they come back when the time is right.
So it's a two-way street, really. You have the people finding out about your podcast or potentially other resources downstream of the podcast and like getting educated and be like, wait a second, those guys actually know what they are talking about. And they end up reaching out to you via Asset Road. But also people that you get first in touch with thanks to Asset Road and who are quite not ready to take the next step with you. You send them back to the podcast to get educated, to get the first things going. And then they're like, oh, actually, those guys know what they're talking about. And they come back to you. can we get a bit tactical about how you do the first one? Meaning, so I see how, so you have classical lead gen and like potential word of mouth. People come to you, you get into a call and you're like, you're quite not ready yet. But what about the other way around? Is it people just listening to the podcast and ending up booking a call and like telling you in the call, hey, I've listened to the podcast and I thought I'd come? Or do you have a system that allows you to take the people from the Finance Bible story downstream to asset road management? How do you do that?
Yeah, so we don't actually run a proper system for it at this point in time.
Interesting.
What we normally do is if we're talking about a specific subject where the listener wants more information, because we can only be so general with what we say in the podcast. Like we can get as specific as we want about a scenario, but if
Of
you're just
course.
slightly that 5% different, it's a whole different scenario. Like that 5% does really make a difference. So at the end of the podcast, we obviously have a call to action where if they need more information, they want more information, they want to check things out, they can get in contact with us and we'll often drop a link there. They can do that or send us a DM on Instagram. We get a lot of DMs on Instagram from listeners.
Nice.
And then from there, we can filter through into CRMs and stuff that we need. A lot of the time when they're coming through the podcast, they're very young. It's an initial question where they're like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this, or can you help me with this? They might be going for their first home. And we'll help them with the finance around that situation, help them get that loan, get their home. And then they're in our system where we can help them forever.
So what do you mean with we help them with their first home? Is it like putting the finance plan together? Is it just choosing a home? Is it choosing the right district? Because you know some districts might appreciate better than others. The reason I'm asking, Zeke, is personal finance for me is very much stock related, but obviously I got this wrong because it's like all the finance endeavors that we may have. But I'm a bit curious to understand what is it that you're going to help with the home typically?
First of all, it's also a matter of figuring out how to get into that first home. So
Okay.
without getting into specific client details, I can talk about myself, obviously. When I was 20, or actually, I'll go to 18. When I was 18 years old, I was working, as we know, at the bank.
Yeah.
Um, and I was in a position where I knew I wanted to do things well financially long term. So I sat there and I researched stocks all day, every day. Like I just went hard, learned what I could, and I started investing pretty
Nice.
rapidly. Every spare dollar I had went into shares. I didn't even have a spare $200. I was like, no, I'm going to spend 90% of my paycheck on stocks, and the last 10%,
Nice.
I'm going to make do. I will live. So I did that, and I've turned that into about 130 grand, give or take, um, pretty quickly within like a year and a half. And I was able
That's
to then
nuts.
turn that. Yeah, I did very well. I wouldn't say anyone out there expect the same result because there was a little bit of luck, but there was obviously a lot of research.
Yeah.
And then I pulled all of that out to get into my first property, which was an investment property. I did that at 20, and I built a brand new house and got that rented out. That appreciated quite rapidly as well, like maybe 250 grand in about 3 years. But again, the
It's
reason that
crazy.
performed so well, not only due to the area it was in, but we had COVID, which caused a bit of a boom as well. So again, don't use my results as something to be like, oh, cool, I can go magically do that. It's not that easy, although you will do well. But so we kind of figure out a plan for helping them get to a stage they can buy their first home if that's what they're looking for. But
Yeah.
then we'll also help them with the financing of it as well. So setting up the structure, getting that home loan, whatever grants the government has available. And then if they're in a certain area, okay, where in that area are you going to buy? Because, in every neighborhood, there's good streets and bad streets, good people, bad people, and you've got to get it right.
Man, that is an inspiring experience. Jeez, congratulations. That's crazy to make such a large amount of money in such a short period of time. But it's like everything, right? If you put in the hardcore efforts, in this case, dare I say, you can yield significant results. And of course, there will always be a part of luck in it, but like you also provoked that luck. So love it. What were things that you found challenging in the podcast, Zeke? Like, what were some challenges, fails, and of course, how did you walk around them to turn them into success and kept on going for 4 years now?
The
Ah,
the
there is something
initial
coming.
yeah, the initial sort of issue with the podcast was like getting your head around the fact that you were launching a podcast, right? Like you're doing something where you're trying to get people to tune in and listen to what you have to say. Like
Yeah,
people actively have to then sit down and take time out of their day to listen to you. Like it's just a very weird concept thinking that people are going to do that. Like, you know, you can sit down and watch Netflix, you can sit down and play
that is an option
games on
indeed.
PlayStation. Like, there's so many different things and avenues of attention, Instagram, TikTok, where you've just got hours and hours disappearing. Why would they sit there and listen to some random 23-year-old from Australia? Like, you know, it's just a weird thing to
Yeah.
put yourself out there and do. And then there was actually the recording it, listening to your voice and getting familiar with that whole thing. And uh, you sort of choked up on perfection. You sort of choked up on perfection a little bit
Yeah.
initially, and we're like, okay, well, you know, do I put this out there? Do I not? And getting your head around that was probably the big first issue that we had. And then once we did that, it was fine. We realized, okay, well, it doesn't have to be perfect. We're better off just putting the content out there and doing what we can.
Yeah.
And then I remember the very first episode. I was sitting down in a garage with Oscar, and we were holding our microphone and we're sitting on milk crates in the garage. I believe we actually took a photo of it to be like, all right, let's look back on this in a few years' time.
That's perfect.
And that's what we did after that to see where we are now. It's obviously come a long way. But yeah, that was probably the biggest challenge we had initially, just getting our head around that whole thing and putting ourselves out there. But then when we started seeing the listeners come in and how many there was, how long our episodes were, we're like, hang on, people are spending thousands of hours consuming our content. It's obviously valuable to someone, so let's keep doing it.
So we always say, right? Perfect is the enemy of good. And like when you just try to get something perfect, especially at your first shot, it never comes out. So it's super important in this. I agree to like just get going. Like it will get better. You will improve, and obviously now you're in a much nicer setup than in your garage on milk crates, and it's just because things take time, and that does time to build up. Um, so what would you say would be your advice to podcasters or wannabe podcasters, especially the ones who have a business behind it and who'd like to make the link between the two? Like how would you recommend going about that?
I'd absolutely just, first of all, go for it, as in just start the podcast, get it done, put it out there. And again, don't get caught up in trying to be perfect. Just take that leap, do it, and you'll soon see if it's working. Be consistent with it. That's probably the number one thing that I've learned over time. There was a period where we weren't very consistent and it went downhill for a bit and we had to pick it back up, which took a long time. But put it out there. And then when you're trying to figure out how to link it back to your business, just figure out don't think about it as a business, first of all. I think what is valuable? What do people want? What do they need? What are they going to look for? If you can get that part right and then position your business as something that can help with that, it will naturally flow on through to the business. So just try to keep the podcast as valuable as possible. And then when you plug the business at the end of the day, if people are satisfied with your content and they believe you, you've built trust in that, they will come on board.
So when a few things I want to follow up on here. When you say consistency, what do you typically recommend? Because so I'm looking at the Finance Bible podcast right now, and like you're on a new series, part 1 of 12. I see on the Australia's reality check. I need to check out this one. I see that right now you're publishing about once a month. At some point you were publishing every week. So what's the strategy here, and how would you recommend actually scheduling episodes? What is it that made it work for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So our aim now is to get it back to once a week, which we're going to start doing. There's been recent travels for work and stuff like that that has obviously had an impact. So we've learned our lesson of banking some episodes up to cover that shortfall. Ultimately, if you're not consistent, it's not going to, people are going to like forget about it. They're going to miss it. They're going to get annoyed. So
Yeah.
if you say, hey, we're going to publish an episode every Tuesday, publish an episode every Tuesday. Whether it's 10 minutes, 30 minutes, it doesn't matter. Keep it quality and just publish it. But yeah, we're going for a more consistent approach now of weekly. Um, we have done it monthly in the past, obviously, but with this new series, which a new episode should be dropping on Thursday, actually, today's Wednesday here,
Hmm.
then we should be all good to get it out there, keep everything going. And obviously, being part one of 12, we're
That's
going to
cool.
create people who are tuning in to multiple different episodes. They're going to want to hear what's going on throughout it. And that series actually is just about sort of Australia as a whole, where we are as a country. So there's a discussion on everything. You've got housing, you've got politics, you've got interest rates, you've got literally every single thing, our education system. We're going to dive
Nice.
into all of that, break it down bit by bit, and just sort of talk about all the different issues that are happening in Australia and what sort of things can fix them or how we can take advantage of them financially.
I love this. I want to double down on a few things. So first of all, for people listening to us right now, in my opinion, consistency is key. So I love that you're pointing this out, Zeke. And it's not that much of like a, hey, I need to publish a podcast every day, right? Which is what Joe Rogan does, but that's, he's an ovni, literally. He would like that description. But it's more like you want to make it a habit for people to listen to you. Like if I know that for the next 2 months, I'm going to have a new episode of Zeke and Oscar like dropping every Thursday at 8 a.m., I'm much more likely to make the habit of like tuning back in every Thursday at 8 a.m. And actually this part 1 out of 12, so creating a series is not something we've done a lot, but I'm just thinking this is great to create some hype, Zeke. So kudos to you. Like, oh, okay. Now I know I'm in for like a saga almost of, okay, I need to understand what's happening in the Australian economy and how to, make the best out of my personal finance from it. So I think it's also great to like create a mini series, make sure that people will be hyped and be like, oh, I can't wait to tune into part 2 and part 3. So that's definitely the way to go. One last thing that I'd like to discuss, Zeke, especially around the lead nurturing. So how do you, and that's down to content, right? Which is exactly what we're talking about here. How do you choose what to talk about? Because I'm suspecting that the content that you would put out to attract people, right? So to have that kind of top of funnel strategy, meaning people discover you thanks to the podcast or the YouTube video from the podcast or the reels from the podcast or the article from the podcast, doesn't really matter. But people finding out about you thanks to the podcast will typically be looking for certain type of content, right? And the people that you want to nurture, so coming to you first, not quite ready yet, sending them back to the podcast. Do you point people towards different episodes? Like what's the content strategy when it comes to this is for lead nurturing and this is for top of funnel, brand awareness kind of content? How do you manage the mix?
Yeah, so we will typically, pending the kind of client that comes to us, we'll recommend different episodes. So, for example, if they are in their 20s, they're looking for their first home, then we have episodes specifically for that. If they're 25, they're looking for a share portfolio, we have episodes on how to manage that. If they're paying down debt, we've got episodes to manage that. If they're 40 and want to start investing, we've got that. So we've got a bunch of different episodes that they can kind of tune into that we will initially recommend when we send them back through to the podcast. When then it becomes, all right, they've listened to all of them. They're probably going to tune in weekly to suss out what's going on and see if there is anything that relates to them or not moving forward. But we will keep a record of who it was when we talked to them, what they were looking for, and our rough time frame on what we think they can achieve. Then it's our role to get back in contact with them, which we obviously have a system to remind us to do that, and basically just get back to them, see how they're tracking, see what they've taken on board, maybe even ask them about the episode, like, oh, did you find anything in this specific one valuable? And sort of build a personal connection while we go. And then when they're ready to go, they're ready to go. They've done everything, they've taken the steps, and it's a lot easier because they've got that trust between us.
100% makes sense. Is that proper English? That makes 100%
Yeah, that
sense.
works.
Let's put it like this. So, Zeke, I'd like to finish on this. What's your most popular episodes that people can go to and find out about you? Like, what is the episode that has worked the most that I will, spoiler alert, also listen to?
That's actually a really funny and interesting question because I think our number one episode was one of our very first ones about
Classic.
superannuation. But it was a deep dive into superannuation, and superannuation will be in the title. So if you just search on Spotify or whatever, Finance Bible Superannuation, it will pop up. I can probably actually quickly find it as well.
You know, the
But
funniest thing is that I don't even know what superannuation means. So I'm going to have to Google this right now.
superannuation is Australia. In America, you've got like Roth IRA or your 401k. It's sort of like
Okay.
that, but in Australia.
A saving system for workplace pension in retirement involves money earning. Okay, so you have a retirement plan by capitalization in Australia as well then, not by repartition. I think that's the French system, which is a Ponzi scheme, by the way. So not giving any financial advice, but like absolutely crazy. Okay, but so in Australia you have capitalization, which makes much more sense. Okay, cool.
Yeah, so it's basically just
We'll have a look at it.
your companies that pay you are government mandated to pay a portion of that into what's called your superannuation.
Okay.
Your superannuation will then be held with a company. That company invests that money into shares and stuff. They take a fee out of it. It's sort of just like a forced saving account that gets invested by another company and they take a fee. So ultimately, it's just economy boosting. And some of the fees are outrageous and silly and shouldn't be done pending your circumstances. Again, not financial advice.
Yeah.
But you can actually make a self-managed super fund in Australia.
Okay.
So ultimately, you can create your own, take full control of it, minimize fees and stuff like that, and invest it in property and things because you can't do that with a company one. But it was episode number 4, and it was called Why Superannuation is Your Best Friend. Yeah, and to this day, that is still getting new listeners every week, which is crazy because that is in terms of like audio quality, in terms of like everything.
In a garage on milk
Yeah,
crates. Remember, guys?
yeah, it's probably one of our worst that we ever recorded in terms of actual quality,
Okay.
as in recording quality. In terms of content, really good, but we've done many more sort of refreshing that and making it more relevant today. Like there's been more superannuation episodes. But yeah, that will give you a really good breakdown on what superannuation is in Australia and how to utilize it.
This is awesome. Obviously, I'm not really concerned by it, but I'll give it a go. That's interesting, and that's the funny thing. Like, except for very rare cases, most of the most listened to podcast episodes of most podcasts, some among the first ones, because when somebody discovers you, they start with the beginning and they start with the first few episodes. Corporate Treasury 101, which is our very first podcast, to this day, each and every month, the most listened to episode is still the first one. What is corporate treasury? Like there is no way around it. This is the most listened to each and every month. So it shows that you don't need to be perfect to get started because people will still listen, especially years down from now. But it also means that you also come up with valuable content. So give it a go for it and talk about superannuation and why it's your best friend. Zeke, that was
Yeah, it's funny
absolutely
too
awesome.
because
Go ahead.
it's such a niche episode. Like, obviously, it's only
Yeah.
relevant to Australians. And I think our most recent stat was only about 60% of listeners are in Australia. So for that to
Okay.
still be the number one is quite abnormal.
Yeah, here we go. And it's always interesting to hear about how it works in other countries and what we can potentially learn from them, although most of the people it won't be relevant for some people. Zeke, this was absolutely gold. Thanks a lot for coming on Podcast Gurus. If people want to find out more about you, Asset Road or the Finance Bible, where should they go?
Probably go to Instagram first, to be honest. Go to Instagram, type in Asset Road or type in Zeke Guenthroth, Guenthroth, or simply Google Asset Road, and that's got a link to everything. Asset Road is literally what it sounds like. Asset, A-S-S-E-T, Road, R-O-A-D.
Boom.
Nice and easy. That's for emails when people are like, oh, what is your email? Simple.
Should figure
But
it out.
yeah, that's exactly right. But that's probably the easiest way to do it. If you go to Asset Road, all our socials are there, Finance Bible's there. It's all sort of integrated. But yeah, Instagram we post quite regularly and provide information and different tips and stuff. So jump on board.
Absolutely awesome. We'll put all the links in the description. Go and check out what Zeke and Oscar are doing. Zeke, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Gurus.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure.